The hammer struck the anvil with a rhythm that had become Isaiah's heartbeat over 17 years of forced labor. Sparks flying like fireflies in the dim forge as he shaped the very chains that would bind another human soul. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the iron he had secretly hoarded, the blades he had hidden beneath the forge floor, the weapons he had crafted from the symbols of their bondage would finally taste freedom. 10 men waited in the shadows, their hearts pounding as thunder rolled across the Georgia sky, and Isaiah knew there would be no turning back from what came next. The overseer would make his rounds in less than an hour, and by then they would either be running through the swamps toward liberty or lying dead in the mud of the plantation they had called hell for far too long. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1834 and the Whitmore plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of Georgia soil. A kingdom of cotton and cruelty where 240 souls labored under the brutal hand of Marcus Whitmore and his army of overseers. Among those souls was Isaiah Carter, a man whose massive frame and incredible strength had made him valuable from the moment he was sold to the plantation at the age of 14. His mother had wept as the traders dragged him away from the Virginia farm where he was born, and her tears had been the last softness he had known until he learned to find it in the secret smiles of his fellow sufferers and the quiet moments when human dignity refused to be completely extinguished. Isaiah stood 6 feet and 7 inches tall, his shoulders broad as an ox yoke, his hands scarred and calloused from years of working metal in the sweltering heat of the forge. His skin was the color of polished mahogany, marked with the evidence of beatings that had failed to break his spirit, and his eyes held the intelligence that made the overseers nervous when they caught him studying them too carefully. He had been assigned to the blacksmith shop when old Jeremiah, the previous smith, had died of fever, and Marcus Whitmore had recognized that Isaiah's size and strength made him perfect for the brutal work of shaping iron. What Whitmore had not anticipated was that he was giving Isaiah the keys to their liberation. The forge sat at the eastern edge of the plantation, a squat building of brick and timber that radiated heat like the mouth of perdition itself during the summer months. Isaiah worked there from dawn until well past sunset, creating the tools that kept the plantation running. He made hoes and plowshares, hinges and nails, wagon wheels and horseshoes, and yes, he made chains. Heavy iron chains with links as thick as a man's thumb. Shackles that locked around ankles and wrists, collars that marked the enslaved as property. Each piece of bondage he crafted felt like a betrayal of his own soul. But Isaiah had learned to see opportunity where others saw only oppression. He had begun his secret work 3 years earlier, shortly after a failed escape attempt by 2 young men named Gabriel and Moses had ended in their capture and public punishment. Isaiah had been forced to watch, along with every other enslaved person on the plantation, as the 2 men were whipped until their backs were nothing but raw meat, and then fitted with iron collars that extended upward with bells attached, making it impossible for them to rest their heads or move without announcing their presence. The cruelty of it had ignited something in Isaiah that had been smoldering since childhood, and he had made a decision that night that would either lead to freedom or death. He began to steal iron. It was not easy because Marcus Whitmore kept careful inventory of every bar and ingot that came to the forge. But Isaiah was patient and clever. He would take a bar meant to become 4 chains and make it into 3 chains and a hidden blade. He would request extra stock for repairs that did not quite need as much material as he claimed, pocketing the difference. He would collect scraps and broken tools, melting them down in the forge during the dark hours before dawn when no one was watching. Piece by piece, ounce by ounce, he accumulated the materials he would need. The weapons he created were simple but deadly. Long knives with wrapped handles that could be concealed beneath clothing. short swords forged from the very chains that had bound them, spear points that could be lashed to sturdy branches, hatchet heads that could split wood or bone with equal efficiency. He hid them beneath the forge floor, under loose stones in the foundation, inside hollow spaces in the brick walls. And he waited. Isaiah was not a fool. He knew that weapons alone would not guarantee their freedom. They needed a plan. They needed allies, and they needed timing. So he had spent those 3 years carefully, cautiously building trust among certain individuals he had identified as having the courage and determination necessary for what would be the most dangerous night of their lives. There was Nathaniel, a field hand whose wife had been sold away 2 years earlier, leaving him hollow-eyed and desperate for anything that might give his suffering meaning. There was Jacob, who had been born free in Maryland and kidnapped into slavery at age 16, his literacy and knowledge of the wider world making him invaluable to their planning. There was Benjamin, small and wiry, who could move through the darkness like smoke and whose hearing was so acute he could detect an approaching rider from half a mile away. There was Elijah, whose fury burned so hot that Isaiah sometimes worried it would consume him before they made their attempt. There was Joshua, who had been a sailor before his capture and knew the stars well enough to navigate them north. There was Caleb, whose calm demeanor hid a core of pure steel. There was Daniel, who had medical knowledge passed down from his grandmother and would be essential if anyone was injured during their flight. There was Solomon, whose strength nearly matched Isaiah's own. There was Aaron, who could hunt and track better than any man Isaiah had ever known. And there was Levi, the youngest at only 19, but whose quick mind and quicker hands made him perfect for the role Isaiah had planned for him. 10 men, 10 weapons, 1 chance. They had been meeting in secret for months now, gathering in the small hours before dawn in the tobacco barn farthest from the main house, speaking in whispers as they refined their plan. They had studied the movements of the overseers, learning which ones made rounds at what times, identifying weaknesses in the plantation's security. They had cached food and supplies at strategic locations along their planned route. They had memorized the paths through the swamp that bordered the plantation's northern edge, the treacherous terrain that most men would avoid but which offered them the best chance of losing any pursuit. And they had chosen their night, a night that was fast approaching as summer thunderstorms began to roll across the Georgia landscape with increasing frequency. Isaiah brought the hammer down on the glowing metal before him, shaping a horseshoe with practiced precision while his mind worked through the details of their plan for the 1,000th time. The forge fire cast dancing shadows across the brick walls and sweat poured down his face and chest, soaking the rough cotton shirt he wore. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded him painfully of fire and blood. The door to the forge opened, and Isaiah's muscles tensed automatically before he recognized Jacob entering with a broken hoe that needed repair. Jacob was a tall man, lean and weathered, his face marked by a long scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, courtesy of an overseer's whip that had struck higher than intended. His eyes met Isaiah's for just a moment, and in that glance, Isaiah read the message that had been waiting for him all day. Tonight. Jacob set the broken hoe on the workbench and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry to anyone who might be listening. Mr. Whitmore say this need fixing by morning, handle clean broke off. I see it, Isaiah replied, his own voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. I get it done. Jacob nodded and turned to leave, but as he passed close to Isaiah, he murmured words so soft they were barely a breath. Storm coming, big one. Overseers drinking heavy at the main house. Duncan passed out already. Then he was gone, The door closing behind him, and Isaiah was alone with the fire and the iron and the knowledge that after 3 years of preparation, after countless nights lying awake imagining every possible outcome, the moment had finally arrived. He finished the horseshoe mechanically, his hands performing the work while his mind raced through the plan one more time. They would gather at the forge 2 hours after full dark, when the storm was at its height, and the noise would cover any sounds they made. Isaiah would distribute the weapons he had crafted. They would move as one unit to the supply shed and take what food they could carry quickly. Then they would head north, into the swamp, following the route they had memorized. With luck and the cover of the storm, they would have hours before their absence was discovered at the morning roll call. And after that, they would run until they reached freedom or death, and either would be better than another day in chains. The evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. Isaiah completed the repairs he had been assigned, banked the forge fire, and was walking back toward the slave quarters when he heard the first rumble of thunder in the distance. He looked up at the sky and saw clouds building on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Perfect. The slave quarters consisted of a series of rough cabins arranged in 2 rows, each structure housing anywhere from 8 to 12 people in conditions that would have been considered cruel for livestock. Isaiah shared his cabin with 9 other men, most of them field hands who were already exhausted from a day of brutal labor in the cotton fields. They ate their meager evening meal of cornmeal mush and fatback in near silence, too tired for conversation, and began settling into their sleeping spaces as darkness fell. Isaiah lay on his pallet of rough sacking and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of snoring around him and the increasingly frequent rumbles of thunder outside. He had said nothing to the men in his cabin about what was planned for tonight. It was too dangerous to expand the circle of trust any further, and he knew that some men had been broken so completely by their bondage that they might betray an escape attempt out of fear of the consequences. It pained him to leave them behind, but he consoled himself with the thought that if his group succeeded, it might inspire others to make their own bids for freedom. The hours crawled past. Isaiah counted seconds, minutes, marking time by the intervals between thunderclaps as the storm drew closer. Around him, the other men in the cabin had fallen into the deep sleep of exhaustion, their breathing heavy and regular. Outside, rain began to fall, first in scattered drops and then in sheets, hammering on the roof with a sound like distant drums. When Isaiah judged that the time had come, he rose silently from his pallet and moved toward the door. He had positioned himself nearest the exit for exactly this purpose, and he slipped out into the storm without waking anyone. The rain soaked him instantly, warm and heavy, and lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the plantation in stark bursts of white light followed by total darkness. He made his way toward the forge, moving carefully through the mud, keeping to the shadows between the buildings. His heart hammered in his chest, and every sense was heightened, alert for any sign of danger. He passed the overseer quarters and heard loud voices inside, men arguing about cards or dice, exactly as Jacob had reported. The storm had driven them indoors, and they were making the most of an evening off from their usual patrols. The forge was dark when Isaiah reached it, and for a moment fear clutched at his throat. Had the others lost their nerve? Had someone been caught? But then he opened the door and slipped inside, and in the next flash of lightning, he saw them all waiting. 10 shapes in the darkness, silent and tense, ready for what came next. Isaiah moved to the forge and began pulling out the weapons he had hidden. He had wrapped each one in oiled cloth to prevent rust, and now he distributed them among his companions, whispering names as he handed over each blade or spear point. The metal felt cool and solid in his hands despite the warmth of the night, and he thought about all the hours he had spent crafting these instruments of liberation, all the care he had taken to make each one balanced and deadly. When every man was armed, Isaiah picked up the weapon he had made for himself, a heavy sword forged from chain links that had once shackled his own ankles, melted down and reborn as something that could cut through flesh and bone. The handle was wrapped in leather strips, and the blade was nearly 3 feet long, wider near the tip for maximum cutting power. It was not pretty or elegant, but it was functional, and Isaiah had tested it on wood and found it more than adequate for the work it would need to do. "You all know the plan," Isaiah said softly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of rain on the roof. "We move together. We stay quiet. We do not stop for anything unless someone falls behind, and then only one man goes back. If we encounter resistance, we fight our way through, but we do not linger. Our goal is distance and speed. Every mile we put between ourselves and this place before dawn is a mile that improves our chances. Questions?" Silence greeted his words. They had gone over this so many times that there was nothing left to say. Isaiah looked at each face in turn, seeing fear and determination in equal measure, and he felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. These men were trusting him with their lives, following him into the unknown on the strength of his planning and his promise that freedom was possible. He prayed silently that he would not fail them. "Then let us go," Isaiah said. "And may God have mercy on anyone who tries to stop us." They moved out into the storm, a line of shadows slipping between the buildings toward the supply shed on the northern edge of the plantation complex. The rain was falling so hard now that visibility was reduced to just a few feet, and the thunder was nearly constant, a rolling barrage that would mask any sounds they made. Isaiah led the way, the sword heavy in his hand, his eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The supply shed was a large wooden structure where tools and provisions were stored, and Isaiah knew from his years on the plantation that it was locked but not guarded. The overseers were too confident in their control, too sure that the enslaved were too cowed to attempt theft. That confidence was about to cost Marcus Whitmore dearly. Levi moved forward with the iron bar, and within seconds he had pried the lock from the door. They entered quickly, and by the light of a shuttered lantern that Benjamin had brought, they grabbed what they could. Sacks of cornmeal, smoked meat, dried beans, canteens that they filled with water from the barrels stored inside. They worked with practiced efficiency, taking only what they could carry at a run, and within 5 minutes they were back outside and moving north. The route to the swamp took them past the cotton fields, vast expanses of mud and darkness where the plants stood in endless rows like an army of silent witnesses. Isaiah led them along the edge of the fields, staying close to the tree line, moving as quickly as the terrain would allow. Behind him, he could hear the heavy breathing of his companions, the squelch of boots in mud, the rustle of their stolen supplies. They had covered perhaps half a mile when lightning illuminated a figure ahead of them, standing in their path. Isaiah's blood turned to ice as he recognized Luther Hayes, one of the overseers, a man known for his casual cruelty and his skill with the whip he always carried. Hayes was staring at them with an expression of shocked disbelief, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt, his mouth opening to shout an alarm that would bring every white man on the plantation running. Isaiah did not hesitate. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and swung his sword in a horizontal arc that caught Hayes across the throat. Blood sprayed black in the darkness, and Hayes made a choking, gurgling sound as he fell backward into the mud. Isaiah stood over him for a moment, watching the life leave the overseer's eyes, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and horror at having taken a human life. But there was no time for reflection. The deed was done, and now their need for speed and distance had become even more desperate. "Move," Isaiah commanded, and they ran. The swamp was a nightmare of standing water, tangled vegetation, and treacherous footing. Trees rose like skeletal fingers from the murky depths. Their branches hung with Spanish moss that brushed against faces like the fingers of ghosts. The storm continued unabated, lightning providing sporadic illumination that revealed a landscape of water and shadow and thunder that made conversation impossible even if they had wanted to speak. Joshua led them now, using his knowledge of the stars to maintain their northern heading despite the clouds that obscured the sky. Isaiah stayed at the rear of their column, his sword in hand, constantly looking back to see if they were being followed. The water was sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, and the mud beneath tried to suck the boots from their feet with every step. Hours passed. The storm began to weaken, the rain falling to a drizzle and then stopping altogether, though the clouds remained thick overhead. Isaiah's arms ached from carrying his sword and his share of the supplies. His legs burned with fatigue, but he pushed forward and his companions pushed forward with him, driven by the knowledge that every step took them further from bondage. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they emerged from the swamp onto firmer ground, a forest of pine and oak that stretched as far as they could see. Isaiah called a halt, and they collapsed beneath the trees, gasping for breath, checking themselves for injuries. Levi had a cut on his arm from a branch. Benjamin's leg had been bitten by something in the water, though not seriously. But they were all alive, and they were still free. "We rest for 1 hour," Isaiah said. "Then we move again. By now they will have discovered we are gone. By midday they will have dogs and riders searching. We need to put as much distance as possible between us and the plantation before they pick up our trail." They ate small portions of the food they had stolen, drank sparingly from their canteens, and tried to dry their clothes in the gradually warming air. Isaiah sat with his back against a tree and allowed himself to think about what they had done. They had killed a white man. In the eyes of the law, they were not just escaped slaves, but murderers. If they were caught, the punishment would be swift and brutal. They would be hanged, or worse, made examples of in ways designed to terrorize anyone else who might consider rebellion. But they had also struck a blow against the system that held them in chains. They had proven that enslaved people were not passive victims, that they had the capacity for violence and resistance. And Isaiah knew that the story of what had happened this night would spread, whispered from plantation to plantation, becoming legend. The blacksmith who forged weapons from chains, the 10 men who walked into the storm and disappeared into freedom. Whether they survived or not, they had already won a victory. The hour passed too quickly. Isaiah roused his companions and they began moving north again, maintaining a steady pace that ate up the miles. They had no map, no clear destination beyond a vague understanding that freedom lay to the north, perhaps in the mountains, perhaps beyond the borders of Georgia into states where slavery's grip was less absolute. They would follow the North Star when the clouds finally broke and trust in God and their own resourcefulness to see them through. The sun rose behind the clouds, turning the sky a pale gray. They walked through forest and field, avoiding roads and any sign of human habitation. Once they heard dogs barking in the distance and immediately changed direction, moving east for several miles before turning north again. Twice, they saw riders on the horizon and hid in thickets until the danger passed. By afternoon, exhaustion was beginning to take a serious toll. Nathaniel stumbled and fell, and it took 2 men to help him back to his feet. Solomon was limping from a turned ankle. Even Isaiah, with his incredible strength and endurance, was feeling the strain of more than 24 hours without sleep and the constant tension of their flight. They came upon a stream as the sun was beginning to descend toward evening, and Isaiah decided they would risk a longer rest. They needed water, and they needed to tend to their injuries before they became serious problems. They found a sheltered spot where the stream ran beneath an overhang of rock, providing concealment from above, and they collapsed into the space like men who had run from hell itself. Daniel examined everyone's injuries using strips torn from his shirt to bandage cuts and abrasions. Solomon's ankle was swollen but not broken, and Daniel wrapped it tightly, instructing him to keep weight off it as much as possible. Levi's arm wound was cleaned with water from the stream, and Daniel applied a poultice made from plants he had found growing nearby, his grandmother's knowledge passed down through generations of healing. They ate more of their stolen provisions and refilled their canteens. Joshua studied the sky, noting the direction the clouds were moving and calculating their position. Jacob, who could read and write, used a stick to draw a rough map in the dirt, marking what he knew of Georgia's geography and trying to estimate how far they had come. "Maybe 30 miles, he said quietly. "Maybe a bit more. We are making good progress, but we have a long way to go. The North Star will lead us to Tennessee eventually, and from there perhaps to Kentucky. I have heard there are people in those places who help fugitives reach even further north, all the way to states where slavery does not exist." "How far is that?" Elijah asked. His fury seemed to have burned itself out over the course of their flight, leaving behind a weariness that made him look older than his 30 years. "Hundreds of miles," Jacob replied honestly. "Many weeks of travel, maybe months. We will need to find food and shelter along the way. We will need to avoid patrols and slave catchers. It will not be easy." "Nothing worth having ever is," Isaiah said. "But we are free now, brothers. No matter what happens from this point forward, we have tasted freedom. That is something they can never take from us, not truly. Even if they catch us and kill us, we will die as free men who chose resistance over submission." The words seemed to strengthen them, and Isaiah saw renewed determination in the faces around him. They rested until the sun touched the horizon, and then they moved on, walking through the gathering darkness with Joshua navigating by landmarks he had memorized during their daylight travel. The clouds finally broke around midnight, revealing a vast canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. Joshua found the North Star immediately, that constant point of light that had guided fugitives for generations, and he adjusted their course slightly to align with its guidance. The night was cool and clear, and they made excellent progress, covering what Isaiah estimated to be another 10 or 12 miles before exhaustion forced them to stop again. They found shelter in a small cave, really just a hollow beneath a massive fallen tree, and they took turns sleeping and keeping watch. Isaiah took the first watch, sitting at the entrance to their shelter with his sword across his knees, staring out into the forest and thinking about what lay ahead. He thought about his mother, wondered if she was still alive, wondered if she had heard that her son had escaped and if the knowledge brought her joy or fear for his safety. He thought about all the people still enslaved on the Whitmore plantation, still laboring under the overseer's whip, and he felt a pang of guilt that he had not been able to save them all. He thought about Luther Hayes dying in the mud, and he examined his conscience for remorse but found only a cold satisfaction that one agent of oppression had been removed from the world. Mostly he thought about the men sleeping behind him, the brothers who had trusted him enough to risk everything on his plan. He had made them a promise of freedom, and he was determined to fulfill that promise or die trying. The days that followed established a pattern. They traveled by night when possible, covering as much ground as they could under the guidance of the North Star. During the day they hid and rested, always alert for signs of pursuit. They foraged for food to supplement their dwindling supplies, gathering wild berries and nuts, catching fish in streams when they dared risk the time it took. Aaron proved invaluable, using snares to catch rabbits and squirrels that provided much-needed protein. They saw evidence of civilization, farms, and small towns, but they avoided all contact with other humans. Trust was a luxury they could not afford. Any white person would be obligated by law to report fugitive slaves, and even free black people might betray them out of fear of being associated with their escape. They were alone in their flight, dependent only on each other and their own resourcefulness. On the 5th day, disaster struck. They were moving through a stretch of open farmland, having decided to risk daylight travel because the alternative was a long detour around the cleared fields. They had made it perhaps halfway across when they heard the sound that every fugitive feared above all others: the baying of hounds on a scent trail. Isaiah's heart sank as he turned and saw them coming, a pack of 5 or 6 dogs with riders behind them, still distant but closing the gap with terrifying speed. The dogs had found their trail, probably where they had crossed a road or passed too close to some farmstead. And now the hunters were coming with all the resources and determination that the slave system could bring to bear. "Run," Isaiah commanded, though the order was unnecessary. They were already running, sprinting across the open field toward the tree line on the far side. But Isaiah knew they would not make it. The dogs were too fast, and some of his companions were injured or exhausted. They needed a different solution. "Joshua, take them into the trees," Isaiah said, grabbing the sailor's shoulder. "You keep moving north. Do not stop. Do not look back." "What are you going to do?" Joshua demanded, his eyes wide with understanding and horror. "I'm going to buy you time," Isaiah replied. He looked at the other men, saw their protests forming, and cut them off with a gesture. "There is no debate here. I am the strongest, and I am armed the best. I will hold them as long as I can. You take the others and run. That is an order." "We will not leave you," Nathaniel said, his voice breaking. "You will, because I am asking you to," Isaiah said gently. "Because this is the only way any of us survive. Because someone needs to carry the story of what we did here, and that someone is you. Now go. Please, go." They went stumbling toward the trees with tears streaming down their faces, and Isaiah turned to face the approaching hounds. He drew his sword, the weapon he had forged from chains, and planted his feet in the earth. The dogs were perhaps 200 yards away now, and he could see their open mouths, their lolling tongues, the single-minded intensity of their pursuit. Behind them, the riders were shouting to each other, 3 white men on horseback with rifles and pistols, confident in their superiority and their right to reclaim escaped property. Isaiah waited until the dogs were within 50 yards, and then he charged to meet them. The first hound leaped for his throat, and he swung his sword in a flat arc that caught the animal mid-air and sent it tumbling away with a yelp of pain. The second dog tried to circle behind him, but Isaiah spun and kicked it with all his strength, feeling ribs crack beneath his boot. The other dogs were suddenly much more cautious, circling him at a distance, growling but no longer eager to close. The riders had pulled up, raising their rifles, and Isaiah knew he had only seconds left. He began to run, not back toward the trees where his companions had fled, but parallel to the tree line, leading the pursuit away from their trail. Rifle shots cracked through the air, and he felt something tug at his shirt, but nothing struck him. He ran with everything he had, his powerful legs eating up the ground, his sword still gripped in his right hand. More shots. One of them found its mark, a burning line of fire across his left shoulder that nearly made him drop the sword. But he kept running, blood flowing down his arm, his lungs burning, his vision starting to narrow. He could hear the riders behind him whooping and hollering like men on a hunt, and he felt a rage so pure it threatened to choke him. Isaiah saw a creek ahead, a small watercourse running along the edge of the field, and he angled toward it. If he could reach the water, he might be able to break his scent trail, might be able to find some opportunity to escape, or at least to take more of them with him when they finally brought him down. He splashed into the creek and began running upstream, the water barely knee-deep but cold and clean. Behind him, the riders reached the bank, and one of them urged his horse into the water after him. Isaiah spun to face the horseman, raising his sword, and the white man raised his rifle in turn. They faced each other for a long moment, predator and prey, oppressor and oppressed, two men whose lives had been shaped by a system that dehumanized them both in different ways. And then the rifle fired, and Isaiah felt the impact in his chest like a hammer blow, and he was falling backward into the water. The current caught him and began to carry him downstream. He could not feel his legs anymore, could not feel anything except a strange weightlessness and a coldness that was spreading from his core outward. The sword slipped from his fingers and sank into the mud at the bottom of the creek. Above him, the sky was impossibly blue, with white clouds drifting like ships on a peaceful sea. Isaiah thought about his companions, hoped they had reached the trees and were still running north. He thought about the weapons he had forged, about the 3 years he had spent planning and preparing. He thought about his mother and wondered if she would ever know what he had done. He thought about freedom and what it meant and whether he had truly achieved it, even if only for a handful of days. The water closed over his face, and Isaiah Carter, the blacksmith who had turned chains into weapons, who had led 10 men in a desperate bid for liberty, who had become a legend whispered from plantation to plantation, slipped away into darkness. The 9 men who survived that day made it to the tree line and kept running. They ran through grief and fear, through exhaustion and pain, driven by Isaiah's sacrifice and their own determination not to let his death be in vain. They ran north for 3 more weeks, living like ghosts in the wilderness, always moving, always afraid, until they crossed into Tennessee and found allies among those who aided fugitives. Joshua and Jacob eventually made it all the way to Canada, crossing into freedom with the help of the network of safe houses and brave souls who risked everything to help people escape slavery's grip. Nathaniel settled in Pennsylvania and became a carpenter, using the skills he had learned in bondage to build a new life. Benjamin, Solomon, and Caleb made their way to New York and found work on the docks. Daniel became a freeman barber in Ohio, using his healing knowledge to help his community. Elijah, Aaron, and Levi stayed together, forming a family of choice that sustained them through the difficult years of establishing themselves in a world that still viewed them with suspicion and hostility despite their free status. And they told the story. In churches and meeting halls, in whispered conversations and public speeches, they told the story of Isaiah Carter, the blacksmith who forged weapons from the chains that bound him, who led them to freedom through storm and swamp, who sacrificed himself so that they might live. The story spread like wildfire through the enslaved communities of the South, inspiring other acts of resistance and rebellion, becoming part of the oral tradition that sustained people through the darkest hours. Back in Georgia, Marcus Whitmore faced questions about how 10 enslaved men had managed to escape his plantation, killing one of his overseers in the process. He faced financial losses from the escaped slaves and the cost of pursuing them. He faced whispers that his control was not as absolute as he claimed, that perhaps the enslaved people on his land were not as docile and obedient as he had believed. The story of the escape became an embarrassment that haunted him for the rest of his life. The forge where Isaiah had worked stood empty for months before another enslaved blacksmith was assigned to it. That man, whose name was Moses, found something one day while cleaning out old ash from the fire pit. It was a small piece of iron barely the size of a coin, stamped with a mark that Isaiah had carefully made with hammer and punch during one of his late-night sessions of secret forging. The mark was simple, just a broken chain link. But Moses understood what it meant. He kept the piece of iron hidden in his pocket, and sometimes when the overseers were not watching, he would take it out and look at it, and he would remember that resistance was possible, that bondage was not inevitable, that somewhere out there, 9 men were living free because one man had refused to accept that chains were unbreakable. The Civil War came decades later, and slavery was finally abolished, but the story of Isaiah Carter lived on. It became part of the larger narrative of resistance and rebellion, joining the stories of Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, of all those who had fought against the evil institution in ways large and small. Historians would debate the details, question whether all the facts were accurate, argue about numbers and dates and specific events. But the core truth remained undeniable. A blacksmith named Isaiah Carter had taken the very symbols of his oppression and transformed them into instruments of liberation. He had proved that the enslaved were not property but human beings with agency and courage. He had shown that those who profit from injustice should never sleep soundly, because resistance can come from the most unexpected places. In the little community where Joshua and Jacob settled in Canada, they built a small monument from stones gathered from the fields they now farmed as free men. They carved Isaiah's name into the largest stone, along with the names of the others who had made that desperate run for freedom. And beneath the names they carved the symbol Isaiah had used, a broken chain link, simple and powerful. People who passed by would sometimes stop and ask about the monument, and the old men would tell them the story. They would describe the forge and the secret work, the storm and the flight through the swamp, the pursuit and Isaiah's final sacrifice. And they would always end by saying that every person who heard the story became responsible for carrying it forward, for ensuring that the memory of those who fought for freedom would never be forgotten. Nathaniel, who became a skilled carpenter in Pennsylvania, made a habit of carving small wooden tokens in the shape of broken chain links. He would give them to children in his community, especially young boys, and he would tell them about Isaiah and about courage, and about the importance of standing up against injustice, even when the cost might be everything. Some of those children grew up to be leaders in the abolitionist movement, and they would later say that the story of the blacksmith who forged weapons from chains had shaped their understanding of resistance and determination. The weapons that Isaiah had crafted, those blades and spear points forged from the iron of bondage, were lost to history. Some were probably left behind in the flight from the plantation, hidden in the swamp, or dropped during moments of panic. The sword that Isaiah had wielded in his final stand sank into the mud of that nameless creek and was never recovered. But the memory of what those weapons represented, the symbolic power of turning the instruments of oppression into tools of liberation, that resonated through generations. Daniel, the healer who had tended everyone's wounds during their flight, established a small medical practice in Ohio that served both black and white patients. He never turned anyone away based on their ability to pay, and he became known for his skill and his compassion. Late in his life, he began writing down his memories of the escape, creating a document that his descendants would preserve and eventually donate to a historical society. In his account, he described Isaiah as the bravest man he had ever known, someone who had combined physical strength with strategic thinking and moral courage in a way that inspired everyone around him. Elijah, Aaron, and Levi, the three who had stayed together, opened a blacksmith shop in a small town in upstate New York. They were skilled workers who had learned their trade under different circumstances on various plantations, and they built a successful business serving the community. But they also used their forge for another purpose. They made it a stop on the Underground Railroad, hiding fugitives in a secret room beneath their shop and providing them with tools and supplies for the next leg of their journey north. And every year, on the anniversary of their escape, they would close the shop and spend the day in reflection, remembering Isaiah and honoring his memory. Benjamin and Solomon, who had found work on the docks in New York, became union organizers, fighting for the rights of workers regardless of color. They faced violence and intimidation, but they never backed down, and they would often invoke the story of Isaiah when rallying their fellow workers. They would say that if a man could forge weapons from his own chains, then surely a group of workers could organize and demand fair treatment from those who profited from their labor. The metaphor was powerful and effective, and it helped build solidarity across racial lines during a difficult period. Caleb, the quiet one whose calm demeanor had hidden a core of steel, became a teacher. He educated the children of freed slaves and free-born black people, teaching them to read and write and calculate, giving them the tools they would need to build better lives. But he also taught them history, making sure they knew the stories of resistance and rebellion, ensuring they understood that freedom had been won through struggle and sacrifice. And in every class, at some point during the year, he would tell the story of Isaiah Carter and the 9 men who followed him into the storm. The Whitmore plantation declined in the years following the escape. Marcus Whitmore's reputation never fully recovered from the embarrassment of losing 10 enslaved men in a single night, and his authority was quietly questioned by his peers. Other escapes followed, smaller in scale but equally determined, as the story of Isaiah's rebellion inspired others to seek their freedom. The plantation limped along until the Civil War finally destroyed the economic system that had sustained it, and it was eventually broken up and sold off in pieces. The forge where Isaiah had worked was dismantled, the bricks salvaged for other construction projects, the tools scattered or sold. But the ground where it had stood remained, and in later years, when historians came looking for the site, local descendants of enslaved people could point out exactly where the blacksmith had done his secret work. They said that sometimes late at night you could still hear the ring of hammer on anvil, the sound of Isaiah Carter forging weapons from chains, a ghostly echo of resistance that would never be fully silenced. The broader impact of Isaiah's escape and the story that grew around it is difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. In the years leading up to the Civil War, as tensions between North and South escalated and the question of slavery's future dominated national politics, stories like Isaiah's played a role in shaping public opinion. They provided concrete examples of enslaved people's humanity and agency, countering the degrading stereotypes that slavery's defenders promoted. They inspired abolitionists and frightened slaveholders, contributing to the growing sense that the institution could not be sustained indefinitely. Frederick Douglass, the great orator and abolitionist who had himself escaped from slavery, heard the story during his travels and incorporated elements of it into his speeches. He would describe Isaiah as an example of what enslaved people could accomplish when given the opportunity, using the blacksmith story to argue for immediate emancipation and full citizenship rights. Harriet Tubman, who led hundreds of people to freedom through her work with the Underground Railroad, knew some of the men who had escaped with Isaiah, and she would sometimes tell the story to encourage the frightened fugitives she was guiding north. As the Civil War broke out and enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines in increasing numbers, many of them brought stories with them. Stories of resistance and rebellion, of escapes successful and failed, of individuals who had refused to accept their bondage. Isaiah's story was among them, told and retold, embellished and refined, becoming part of the larger narrative of Black resistance to slavery that was finally being acknowledged and celebrated. After the war, during Reconstruction, when formerly enslaved people were briefly able to participate in political life and shape their own destinies, Isaiah's story was invoked by leaders arguing for full civil rights. They would point to men like Isaiah as proof that Black people were fully capable of self-governance and did not need white paternalism or control. The broken chain link became a symbol used by some Reconstruction-era politicians and activists, representing both the end of slavery and the ongoing struggle for true equality. But Reconstruction failed, and the backlash against Black advancement ushered in decades of Jim Crow segregation and racial terror. During this dark period, the stories like Isaiah's went underground again, told in black churches and homes but rarely acknowledged in public spaces controlled by white supremacists. The monuments and memorials were torn down, the written histories were suppressed, and a deliberate effort was made to erase the memory of black resistance and replace it with myths of contented slaves and benevolent masters. Yet the stories survived. They survived in oral tradition, passed from generation to generation, preserved by people who understood the importance of remembering their history. They survived in the small tokens and symbols that people kept hidden away, in the names given to children, in the songs and folklore that carried encoded messages. Isaiah Carter's name might have been forgotten in the wider world, but in the communities descended from those he had helped free, the memory remained alive. The 9 men who had escaped with Isaiah all lived to see slavery abolished, though most did not live to see the full promise of freedom realized. Joshua died in 1876, still farming his land in Canada, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his story forward. Jacob lived until 1882, passing away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, his literacy and knowledge having made him a valued leader in his community. Nathaniel succumbed to pneumonia in 1879, but not before establishing a successful carpentry business that his sons continued. Benjamin died in a dock accident in 1885, his body recovered from the river he had worked beside for so many years. Solomon lived to the remarkable age of 86, dying in 1901. Old enough to see the dawn of a new century, but not old enough to see the justice he had fought for fully realized. Daniel practiced medicine until his death in 1893, training several younger men in healing arts and leaving behind detailed records of his techniques and knowledge. Elijah, Aaron, and Levi all died within a few years of each other in the early 1890s. The 3 friends buried side by side in a cemetery they had purchased themselves, their graves marked with headstones that bore the symbol of the broken chain. Caleb taught until he could no longer stand at a chalkboard, dying in 1897 at the age of 74, having educated hundreds of children in his lifetime. Each of these men, in their final days, told the story of Isaiah one more time to whoever would listen. They made their children and grandchildren promise to remember, to pass the story on, to ensure that Isaiah Carter's sacrifice was not forgotten. And those promises were kept generation after generation, even as the details became fuzzy and the exact dates were lost. And the story took on the qualities of legend. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, Isaiah's story was rediscovered by historians researching black resistance to slavery. Old documents were uncovered, including Daniel's written account, and references to the escape in plantation records and newspapers from 1834. The story was published in academic journals and later in popular histories, bringing Isaiah's name back into public consciousness after more than a century of obscurity. A movement began to commemorate the escape and honor the men who had participated in it. Descendants of the 9 survivors contributed funds and worked with local communities to establish historical markers at significant sites. A monument was erected in Georgia, not far from where the Whitmore plantation had stood, bearing the names of all 10 men and describing their daring escape. The broken chain link was incorporated into the design, and the inscription read, "They turned bondage into steel and struck a blow for freedom that echoes through the ages." Schools were named after Isaiah Carter. Scholarships were established in his honor. Artists created paintings and sculptures depicting the blacksmith at his forge, hammer raised. Surrounded by the chains, he would transform into weapons. Writers penned novels and plays dramatizing the escape, sometimes sticking close to the known facts and sometimes taking considerable creative liberties. But all of them captured something essential about the story, the idea that oppression contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. that the tools used to bind can be turned into instruments of liberation. The story resonated particularly strongly with young people who saw in Isaiah an example of someone who had refused to accept the limitations imposed on him by an unjust system. They drew parallels between his struggle and their own fights against racism, poverty, and inequality. The image of forging weapons from chains became a metaphor for turning disadvantage into strength, for using the very obstacles placed in one's path as materials for building something better. Isaiah Carter never saw freedom's full promise realized. He died at the age of 31, cut down in a nameless creek while buying time for his companions to escape. But his impact outlived him by generations. The 9 men he helped free went on to live productive lives, to raise families, to contribute to their communities. Their descendants numbered in the hundreds by the time the Civil War ended, in the thousands by the turn of the 20th century. Each of those lives was possible because Isaiah had forged weapons from chains and led a small group of men into the storm. And every one of them carried forward the lesson that resistance is always possible, that courage can be found in the darkest places, that no system of oppression is so complete that it cannot be challenged. They carried forward the memory of a blacksmith who had looked at the chains meant to bind him and seen instead the raw material for liberation. They carried forward the story of 10 men who had walked into a Georgia storm as enslaved property and emerged as free human beings, willing to die rather than remain in bondage. The story of Isaiah Carter is a story about transformation, about taking the worst that the world can inflict and refusing to let it define you. It is a story about solidarity and sacrifice, about the bonds formed between people who face oppression together. It is a story about the power of planning and preparation, about the way small acts of resistance can accumulate over time into something powerful enough to break chains. It is a story about the high cost of freedom and the people who are willing to pay that cost so that others might live free. It is ultimately a story about hope. Hope that a better world is possible. Hope that courage and determination can overcome even the most brutal forms of oppression. Hope that the arc of history, however long, however circuitous, bends toward justice. Isaiah Carter embodied that hope when he struck his first secret blow in the forge, when he began the long process of turning bondage into steel. He embodied it when he led his companions into the storm, when he sacrificed himself so they could escape. And he embodies it still, in the stories told and retold, in the monuments erected in his honor, in the lives of all those descended from the men he freed. The blacksmith who forged weapons from chains became more than a man. He became a symbol, an idea, a reminder that no matter how dark the night, no matter how heavy the chains, no matter how complete the oppression seems, resistance is possible and freedom is worth fighting for. That legacy, forged in fire and blood and sacrifice, continues to inspire people facing their own struggles, their own chains, their own storms. It reminds them that they too can transform bondage into steel, that they too can strike blows for freedom that echo through the ages. Isaiah Carter's story did not end in that Georgia creek in 1834. It continues wherever people fight against injustice, wherever the oppressed refuse to accept their oppression, wherever someone looks at the chains meant to bind them and sees instead the raw material for weapons of liberation. His hammer still rings in the forge of history, striking sparks that light the way toward freedom.